I say to friends, that I eventually became my own client through a series of different things. But that's kind of what it ultimately happened. And I just, again, it feels like that was absolutely the right move for me. And I have not looked back. I love what I do.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Tree Podcast, the show where we talk to great communicators about how they do what they do. My name is Chris Hobson, and this week we're speaking with Blake Stenning, MA, CAE. Blake is Director of Communications at the Public Housing Authority Directors Association, or PHADA. Blake, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me here. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very interested in your professional journey, and we were even talking about it a little bit before we joined today. You actually went from working as a graphic designer who co-founded a design communications firm to leading actually the communications department at a national nonprofit. So I'm very interested in that, and we'll get into that arc of your career, because I think a lot of people who will be joining today and watching this podcast maybe have one foot in the creative space and one foot in either the nonprofit or corporate space, and are themselves trying to kind of navigate those waters. So to get us started, Blake, I was wondering if you could please tell us a little bit about, or tell me a little bit about the early part of your career. I guess, why did you become a graphic designer to start with, and how did you leverage that talent, when it came time to found the design communications firm?
Sure. Well, it was sort of by accident, excuse me, that I discovered this profession, and it really became kind of a calling for me. It was in high school, and I needed to take an elective, and I saw this sort of visual communication, graphic design elective, and didn't know what that meant, but it sounded interesting. And from the moment I walked in the classroom, I realized, like, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. It was just just complete. And it hit all those buttons, those interests for me. This idea of like creative problem solving, how do you visualize an idea? How do you, what are the different ways you can do this? And in the early days, it was a lot of handwork. So there was, this physical creative process that I really enjoyed. And so when I went to college, I was a fine arts major in graphic design studio, and that's just, like I said, it was all encompassing. It was, just bound and determined that this is what I was going to do. Part of what really was exciting for me with this too is that I am somewhat of a voracious reader, and I'm interested in history, and I discovered this incredible history of graphic design, because like I said, I didn't really know what this was, and I would find these books of these practitioners, and some of them were almost like these manifestos. And wow. It like I said, it became kind of this calling. You felt like you were really doing something for like the greater good. It wasn't just a job to come in and make something look pretty, but there was a whole thought behind it. It's this, they call it like design thinking now, or it certainly was a phrase kind of coined a few years ago, but it really was like this, it was a whole discipline of like, just how do you solve a problem? And some of the writers were very colorful. I mean, there was an author, one of the original like 20th century typographers was a man named Eric Gill, who wrote this tome on typography. And one of the things he had said is that, someone who would use bold italic would just would assume just steal sheep. And I remember thinking, like, that is just the craziest thing I've ever heard. Like, I just,
never forget that.
Yeah, what is this? And, so like when Microsoft Word first came out, it turned a lot of people who never thought about typography into like sheep thieves. For me, I just knew I was going to run my own studio. That was always from the very beginning, because I always had a certain interest in the business side of operations, of running a business, and how do you work with a client, and how do you kind of position yourself in a marketplace and build a client base and just run a good, efficient business. That to me was always very appealing too. And I think maybe that's also part of that sort of creative problem solving. So so I did that, and was managing partner for about 13 years or so, and had a host of clients from nonprofits, associations, arts organizations, and in the early days, .com startups.
It seems like you really kind of you were dealing with clients like you were talking about, but can you talk about how maybe some of them were coming in with their preconceived notions already, and how you kind of reacted to that?
Mm-hmm. Well, so like the early days, particularly with like the I guess late '90s, early 2000s, in this area certainly, we had this explosion of it was like this sort of entrepreneurial revolution here, and all these like .coms companies were sprouting up, and this was so new, and you had this sense of like a better future is in store through software, and this whole like do no evil ethos that sort of came along with that. And in a way, it seems very quaint now.
Right.
But at the time, it really was this startup culture here was really exciting. And it was this idea of like you sort of started from like a blank sheet, and people were trying to develop an identity for a business. They had an idea and they wanted to make it into a thing. And so a lot of the work was really interesting for me because as the principal of my firm, I was working with the principal of this firm that was this fledgling firm. And what I found is over time, I would come in and I'd be given this strategic plan that there was a component of it where they needed, my expertise to help, realize that that's part of it. But then when that was done, I kind of went away and then they continued on. But I just
Right.
more and more was so intrigued with the creative, with the strategic plan, and would find myself thinking like, I wished I was on that side of the table. And I wish that I was the person who was coming up, asking those big questions in the early stage of like, what is it that we do? Who are we and how do we communicate that? What is it that, what's our mission? And so over time, I began to gravitate more to that, and it's just part of your evolution.
Yeah, and I think that's you hit on the word evolution. That's so interesting. So I guess building on that. So is that kind? I think having talked to you, I think that's at the point where you said, let me kind of dip my foot in this water. I've met these certain people. I know the personalities involved. Let me see if I can get a little further forward or ahead in this process. And is that and so how did that kind of naturally extend into the nonprofit world? I
Yeah.
guess how, and maybe if you could also talk about how you found PHADA and how all that took place.
Yeah, sure. So, a couple of things happened right around like say like 2010 or so. Um, One, as I'd mentioned already, the types of projects we were brought in to do had changed a lot. We weren't,
Yeah.
again, it wasn't like we need to come in and do everything for a company. It was much more specific, and it was a lot of similar types of projects, and they were interesting, but it wasn't the same. There wasn't quite the same energy to it, that I liked, that appealed to me. But also a couple of years prior to that, I had discovered fine art photography. I'm not so much discovered it,
Oh.
but I became interested in it, and began to pursue it first as just like a hobby. But I quickly discovered that like this was something that I might even be a better photographer than I am a graphic designer.
Oh, wow.
And I started to do these very intense workshops like in rural Maine, and
Oh,
and again I read up on, I'd read books by Ansel Adams that were this thick about how to
sure.
how to expose a proper negative. I mean just
Wow.
really heady stuff. And so it
Before
was
the
like this
digital days, I guess, right?
pre-digital. This is film. This is very analog.
Film. Oh my gosh. Younger
Yeah,
viewers might not know what the film. Yes.
it's apparently coming back,
Oh,
with the young
sure.
people
Just
today.
like vinyl. Right?
Exactly. But so there was this technical side. There was all this learning. There was all this discovery. But again, it was this kind of thing where like a few people that really knew this stuff were so passionate about it. and I began to meet fellow photographers, and they were all really interesting people and came from very diverse backgrounds. And and I realized that this was something that was going to be more than just a hobby. And eventually, I had become juried into the Torpedo Factory Art Center in
Oh,
Alexandria, Virginia.
Alexander, Virginia.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's a pretty big deal. And became a member of the Multiple Exposures Gallery, which was a collective photography, fine art photography gallery space. And through that, I was invited to join the board of a small photography school and gallery space in Glen Echo Park, Maryland, called PhotoWorks. And that work on the board was really my introduction to. It's like the first time I was really involved in like a community and
Hmm.
building something where it mattered to people. Like they, the people came here because they wanted to be a part of this. They felt this passion, this need. And and that was something I wasn't getting with my client work. It's not possible to get with that
Wow.
with what I did.
Right.
But it was something that became more and more important to me. And so I kind of had this. I had a sort of a, I guess you could say, a professional midlife crisis. And I used to joke when I started my business that I'm sure there's going to be a day when I don't want to do another logo. And I kind of half jokingly said that, but it actually came true.
Hmm.
And so I thought maybe I'll get an MFA in fine art photography and I'll be a fine art photographer. But I also I didn't want to have to do. And then I was just doing client work again. I was doing kind of the same thing, just at a different medium.
Right.
And I kind of stumbled across this field called arts management. And and I started looking, and there were some programs. There were two schools locally here that taught arts management, had master's degree programs in arts management, and it was this idea of like you were the executive director of a nonprofit that was arts based, but it was this community. It was all these things I was doing, and it just felt like a natural extension. It was kind of taking all this and all the past experience I had professionally. So I wasn't like just leaving it all behind. I was taking all those things and taking it to a whole different place. And so that's what I did. I went back to grad school and studied arts management. And during my time there, I did an independent study on creative placemaking. And creative placemaking is this idea of how, in areas where they're they're sort of forgotten areas, a lot of artists can move in and through activities there begin to breathe new life into a community. You could say a lot of times it leads to gentrification. There's a whole lot of social and kind of urban planning issues that surround it. So it's not, I don't want to get into any of the specifics of that, but there was this idea of like, there are people that are doing something on this sort of grassroots level that are helping to build a community. And that was really appealing to me. And so when I graduated, I was thinking like, okay, now what am I going to do? What am I going to, run a photography gallery? I thought that might be something I would do. And as I was looking, I came across this position for communications director at a professional trade association that served low income housing. And it was like, well, that totally aligns with something I was just doing.
Right.
And I know I could do the job. It's there were other parts of it too that were really appealing to me. It was like, well, that just feels like such a natural fit. And so things worked out well, and I started there. And so I eventually, so I say to friends, that I eventually became my own client through a
Yeah.
series of different things. But that's kind of what it ultimately happened. And I just, again, it feels like that was absolutely the right move for me. And I have not looked back. I
Wow.
love what I do every day.
Blake, before we go any further, I want to make sure the audience understands what PHADA is and kind of, the purpose that you all serve.
Well, so so PHADA is the Public Housing Authorities Directors Association, and we are a national trade association that represents about 1,900 housing authorities across the U.S. That's probably 2/3 of all that are members of us. And our mission really is to provide, information, advocacy, and professional development for the people that run these organizations, so that they can, administer these programs that help, several million Americans who rely on assisted housing for, to be able to survive. Um, so as a trade association, it's the organization that is our member. Our primary contact is the executive director, and our organization was actually founded. We were kind of a spinoff of another, a sister organization, but our focus was really on the people running the agencies, and
Right.
and providing, policy analysis and advocacy on like that federal level. So we we're the liaison to HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, that has these federal programs for, funding, assistance on housing, through vouchers, through tax credits to be able to develop, new or rehab housing. And then we also deal with Congress, who developed, who passed the legislation that HUD has to adhere to. So primarily our audience is that level, and they they have certain needs that they need, and they have a certain understanding already of the content that we're producing. But within that, yes, we have, where we really are focusing on, beyond that top level, are like, again, the second in command, or maybe like people who are running different programs. So we host 3 separate conferences per year. Our commissioners conference is an interesting one in that has a lot of programming and sessions that are geared towards commissioners. So every housing authority has its board of directors, basically a board of commissioners, that are appointed by like the mayor, for so it'll include some residents, it'll include local business leaders, and so those are people that may or may not understand, have a really, they probably need a more simplified understanding of some of the issues, and they're dealing with governance, and so they need information that's really relevant to them, for those needs.
It's so interesting that blank paper idea. It's obviously appropriate to what you do visually as an artist, and I guess you can extend that to, oh, I have this big canvas of either nature or wherever you're going to take your pictures. But it's almost interesting because this idea seems to have followed you through your career, because the idea of artists moving in and maybe breathing, like you said, new life into a community, that's not necessarily a blank page, but that is like a new beginning in a sense. So I really like this kind of motif that's emerging here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and and I'm sorry to kind of jump back and forth between your design years and your kind of years at PHADA, but this next question kind of combines the two. But an important part of the user's journey on any website, or when they kind of first engage with any person or organization, is kind of like a consistency, whether that be in voice or in branding, for sure. So one part of your profile, I was kind of like reading your profile, and that leapt out to me, is that and I'm going to quote you on this, actually, you've implemented a comprehensive revamp of communication support materials, and I'm assuming mostly on the website, PHADA's website, that unified the voice and visual presentation of advocacy, policy, and membership resources. So I was wondering if you could talk, kind of as an extension of what you've been talking about, talk a little bit about how you did that, and how that kind of evolution has improved the user experience, particularly when it comes to the PHADA website, because I have navigated around that website and I find it very easy to use and find great resources there.
Well, thank you for that, because that was the ultimate goal. Um, so yeah, so going back to kind of the beginning of it, because it really was one of the reasons I one of my initial sort of charges when I came there was to redo the website. but by doing that, this is not a, just snap your fingers and it's done overnight or, in a weekend. This is something that's a very involved process because, as you know, and I'm sure your viewers understand, the web has so much. This is so much of a organization's presence is online. I mean, digital transformation over the last 2 decades has made that the case, and particularly with nonprofits and associations, where you are doing a lot of advocacy and outreach. It's likely the first place where people come to get information about your organization and what you do. And if that's not organized, if it's not clear, then you're not serving that mission. And so what I did is I began by just doing an audit of all of the communication materials. So when I say the communication support materials, I was looking at just how the logo was displayed across different materials. Was it consistent? Was it recognizable? Were the colors the same? Typography, certainly. Like if it, everything, from print materials, our newsletter, which is a very important part of our outreach. The website, email marketing, everything like that. Like there was no harmony. There was nothing that, if you put all these things and laid them out in front of yourself, you wouldn't think that this all came from the same organization. And, it was pretty apparent to me that the content wasn't the problem. We're a small staff association. We have 9 full-time employees. 3 of them are policy analysts, and they are subject matter experts who understand these complex HUD programs better than probably anybody in the country. And, they've all worked in housing authorities. But, we advise, Hill staffers who oftentimes are, relatively young and new, and they need to get up to speed. So, so the content wasn't the problem, but the problem was that people weren't getting the information they needed when they needed. So that was my initial thing. Was I just kind of hammered it into everybody that we need to make sure that we get information to our members when and where they need it. And we need to make sure that that when they see something from us, it's recognizable immediately that this is from PHADA. And so that just meant, we're gonna simplify what we do. We publish a lot. It's lengthy, policy analysis of some of these programs is very, very in depth. It's not 101 level stuff at all. We have an audience though. It's a small universe, so we know that they understand the basics. So we don't need to simplify it that much, but we need to clarify, and we need to really hone in on what is the important thing that you need to know about this particular HUD notice, this regulation, this funding, stream that's in danger of being, hacked out of the upcoming appropriations or something. And so we the focus on the website was there's going to be 3 things that are going to be what we pay attention to. One is we need to streamline things so that when you come to the site, membership is, so the navigation became like that first thing. Membership is here, advocacy policy is here, publications, and then, education, and events, professional development. Like it was just really easy to you find those things, and everything you're going to want is in those areas. We came up with a grid system that really simplified and was clean. It was a lot of white space because there's a lot of text. Color, we developed a very basic kind of color palette. So it's very, in a way, it's sort of harkens back to those 1950s corporate identity things. But, it's kind of like we didn't want anything extraneous to distract from the important message. So just simplify it as much as you can so that, the emphasis is on what's being discussed. And then technically, we were thinking about what's the member user experience. At the time, with our website and our other kind of fledgling, our tech stacks were all so disjointed that a member had to sign in like 3 different places to be able
Oh
to
boy.
access the website. And then they needed a different login to register for an event. And they needed a different one for this. So we came up with a new system, that was just a single sign on. And it just seemed so revolutionary at the time. It
Yeah.
was so basic. And so we went back to the basics on everything. But from that, we unified that message. We unified it visually so that anything that comes out is like, it's FADA. But we also focused on our voice. We developed an editorial style guide that we never had before, so that when we're using terms or I mean, it's when you're talking about federal programs, there's a lot of acronyms. We live in DC,
Yes.
so make sure that everyone's using the acronyms the same way. Make sure that we're referring to our events the same way, because you start, when you have the annual conference and exhibition, some people might not use an ampersand and some write or they just call it the annual meeting, or these little things that don't seem that important become crucial that as long as people start seeing that same thing over and over and over again, it begins to kind of click, and then they can again focus in on what you're actually saying, rather than like, oh, is that meeting, or is that meeting, or is that organization, who's that? So if people start to, if anyone is confused when they see our stuff, we're not doing our job well enough. And so it's always been the emphasis is that. And just to kind of sum all that up, that goes right back to that blank. Like, I finally am now on that side of the table where I had the blank sheet, and it's just the like, who are we? Why do we do what we do? How do we make sure that gets across to people? And like, now I get to do that, but also see it through too. I don't just come in for a little piece of it and then go away. This is a thing where it's an ongoing, again, evolution of how we do our thing.
Yeah, it's so interesting because you say you have a 9-person organization, and I've worked at different organizations where there's just so many people, and that it's like really hard to get at that base level. And I love your the image of the filing cabinet, because it's such a dual object, right? Because it's highly organized and also highly intimidating. And it's super simple, right? It's like it's not even a machine really, right? But it can inspire panic in people, because if you don't know right where you're going, and you don't know the filing system or whatever, you can just be like a huge waste of time, right? Even though it's highly organized at the same time. So anyway, and and you said 1950s, the kind of feel of the website. I was having this image at the same time in my mind of a person would you'd ask for something, and then a person would have to, like, they would be the expert of the filing system. So they would go up and know where all the files were. And it's so interesting. And now I think we're getting to this point with AI and chatbots, and I'm not even sure if agents is the proper use of that word, but at least with chatbots, where I feel like you'll just go to a website, it'll literally just be a blank screen, and it'll say, what do you want? And you type in what you want, and it'll bring it to you, as opposed to you having to filter down to what it is you want. So we're kind of in another interesting transition period right now. But I don't know if you guys are there yet. But.
Oh, totally. I mean, I'm practically, you can't see me bouncing in my seat right now, but that's actually right where we are right now.
Oh, interesting.
So
okay.
we are in the so everything we've done now, we are ready to start all over again.
Oh no. Well, that's not bad. Blank sheet, right?
Yeah, in a good way. I mean, it's, for me, maybe I have to drag people along, but I think we've been talking about this for a long time internally, and I think everybody at this point is really on board with it, and they really see the value. And so we are currently working with an outside consulting firm on our IT maturity assessment. And so that's taking into account the website, our AMS, so the member management database, and all of our tech stacks and how they work together. And, looking at where is technology today? How are people getting their information? I think in the association world, there is this sort of, there is a crisis going on right now of declining membership. And it's just a trend that we're seeing everywhere, that people aren't joining organizations the way they once did, because their needs have changed. The information that they want, they can get elsewhere. And so I think we're in that place where we're sort of asking ourselves, like, what is our what is our value? What is our purpose? What do we bring to this industry that is needed? And you mentioned AI. I mean, we are absolutely looking at that as a means for personalization. The personalization, segmenting our content so that people that are focused on tax credits for real estate development are getting that information, and the people that are focused on executing running a voucher program for in public housing or something like that are getting that information, or professional development. We're seeing a lot of people coming into this industry that didn't come up through the ranks, which was sort of the historical norm for us. And so there's a lot of people that they don't understand it all. And I can relate to that because I really didn't know anything about, low income housing other than just a few things when I started. But I do know that the people that are on the ground who are doing this, I think, care about this more than any group of people I think I've ever encountered. And so, again, I mean, like as their residents look to them to provide something that's vital for their survival, our members are looking to us in that same way. And so, that's that. So we look at things like AI as like, maybe this can really be that thing that we've been needing, so that people come to us first for, they're not going to Google, a question. They know that they can come to us. Maybe it's been hard for them to find exactly what they're looking for. They're not quite sure what they're looking for, what they need. But again, we can facilitate that in a way that takes everything that they need and brings it to them, on a very, personal level, on a very, individual level. So that's something that's, hugely of great interest to us, and that we definitely see as long as it can live up to the hype
and not hallucinate constantly.
Yeah, not hallucinate constantly. That's right. That's an area where I think we really want to explore a lot more.
Given the diversity of your membership and sort of their constituency, how do you go about strategizing how you pitch, whether you're explaining a policy position or any other kind of complex matter? How do you go about strategically pitching those tonally, I mean, so that you're not either talking over someone's head or talking down to them?
Well, our membership is a very finite sort of ecosystem, and so for the most part, like we don't need to focus on like kind of the 101 level of disseminating information. Like they understand what a lot of they understand the programs, they understand the funding issues, that type of thing. But what a lot of what we do, I may have mentioned, so it's FADA is a trade association. The organization is our member. The executive director is our primary contact. Those are the people that sit on our board. They're on most of our committees, and so a lot of what we're doing is trying to distill or get to here's the thing that matters to you right now in your day-to-day operations. This is the thing that like needs your attention today to make, to take some action on. So that's our primary contact. And sort of in relation to that, I think I will say like our job in some ways is like to advocate for our members' needs with HUD and Hill staffers, and then we also need to communicate those regulatory legislative issues from Congress and HUD to our members, and so we really do sort of facilitate this back and forth to a degree, dialogue. We do find that when we're on Capitol Hill, sometimes like if there's like a new Congress and there are new people coming in who are sitting on committees for the first time, we might need to get their staff up to speed on some of these programs. So some of our bigger outreach publications, like our issue briefs or our position papers, those are condensed down into like 1 or 2 pages. So you get like, here's the issue. These are the things that are, front and center right now, and we can hand those off. And that's a really important part of our communications, strategy is to communicate to those two audiences. In addition, we have 3 conferences per year, one of which is a commissioners conference. And so every housing authority has a board of commissioners that are appointed, locally. And they can include, business leaders, but you usually have some residents too from the housing authority. So that's a particular audience. And we will gear some sessions that are, related to governance, for them, so that they understand how to run, a housing authority, and develop, a strategy, and again, good governance for running, the agency. We have seen a lot of attrition over the last decade or so, with our members are nearing retirement age, and so there's a whole new crop of EDs coming in, and a lot of them have come in from outside of the industry. They didn't come up through the ranks as they historically may have, and so that's a whole different audience where they need the same information that our longtime members, but they need it in a different way. One of the things we've started to do at our conferences are have these roundtable discussions that are for new executive directors only, and they come into a room. And those are some of the most interesting. Like, I've been in the room and listened to them and some of the issues that they're talking about. And it's a lot of this, like, oh my God, how do I do this? Like, we're facing this problem and somebody else is over there like, oh, hey, we had that same thing. This is what we did.
Oh, wow.
And in fact, that's something that we as an organization, like after our conferences, we will have internal discussions about like, like, here are the 5 things that that really is like, a hair on fire thing for new EDs. How do we keep that conversation going, beyond the conference, and I think I've talked a little bit about like some of our we're doing some assessments on our tech stacks right now. So we're looking at like, what are, community platforms that we might, be able to kind of host. But if we do that, how are we going to make sure that we keep that conversation going? It's one thing to just like, here's this new platform, this is the new shiny for you guys. But like, how do you really get people, I don't like to use the word authentically, but just, like authentically, genuinely engaged in this in a way that like they come to it and they get something out of it, rather than, we're dragging them in here because we built this thing for you guys, darn it,
Right.
So,
or what happens sometimes is you get a couple people who just dominate that conversation.
Or you get a couple people,
yeah, you don't have a diversity of viewpoints.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
So, those are things that we're always looking at, is like, how are we making sure that our constituents' needs are being served on these different levels? And it's also like, where do you also draw the line? Because you can't serve everybody. You need to make sure that the important information gets to the people it needs to get to, and so you can never lose sight of that in this ongoing effort to increase engagement.
I'm always so interested to ask people about the crisis communications component of what they do, because you always get different answers, and it's so interesting how people pivot it kind of under distress, right? In a sense. So, I mean, one obvious starting point is COVID, and to me, it's obvious that we would start there because, as you so eloquently talked about, you're sort of a conduit between your constituents and the U.S. Department on Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, for so much of that back and forth conversation. So, how if you could talk just for a minute about during COVID, I know people if people couldn't work, they couldn't pay rent. Then landlords, there was a knock-on effect, and at a certain point there was an eviction moratorium that went in place, and then towards the end of COVID, there was the reinstatement of evictions and things like that. So I'm wondering, like, how did you navigate all that as communications director?
Yeah. It was it was a moving target. It's funny, like when I talk about COVID and some of the early days, it seems like forever ago, and it seems like yesterday. We all went through it. We all shared this experience, and but there were it affected us differently. So for myself, for our organization, for a lot of associations, we were able to go remote, but our members were not able to go remote. I mean, they have residents. They're serving. Housing authorities are like hospitals. It's been described to me by one of our trustees, and it's like you've got residents. Like people still need somebody to fix the plumbing
Right.
or change a light bulb or there's people who out there are a significant number of people who live in assisted housing who have disabilities um, or are elderly. So they need a whole level of services, and you can't those things don't translate into virtual. And so we're all trying to figure out, oh my God, what do we do? We were fortunate that we recently had switched over to like our Office 365 platform that had Teams, and it's funny. I remember as like kind of COVID was this thing that just kept being talked about more and more,
Right.
and this idea of like people are going to have to stay home, and like, well, if we stay home, how are we going to work? And so I saw we had there's this collaboration sort of video thing that we can do. And so I talked to my boss about like maybe we ought to do like some basic training on this just in case, even if this COVID thing isn't in anything, like we always get like a hurricane that knocks power out for a couple of days every couple of years, or a snowstorm or something. So maybe we ought to just have this in our back pocket so we know what to do. And it turns out like, weeks after doing just an in-house training that we kind of just put together, we left the office and some of us never came back.
Wow.
And so during that time, nobody sort of knew what to do, and you just kept trying like, and federal agencies were doing their absolute best. HUD's trying to make sense of like, how do we make sure we're still getting funding to agencies? What are we have to stop doing physical inspections, but how do you still ensure that people are living in safe sanitary adequate
Wow,
housing and
that's
things like
true.
that?
Yeah.
So all sorts of we pivoted to webinars, these new things called webinars, and we started having Teams meetings, and we started doing all sorts of virtual conferences. So we kept our and we would put out to our members like, if you have a problem, please contact us. Here's our policy analyst list, and just tell us what you need, and we were going to talk to HUD. And we had this open line. And so we began to, as things at least began to feel a little bit like, okay, we're getting our handle on this a little bit. We developed a COVID resource page, and that evolved as more updates would come out from from the federal side. We had a whole section on waivers, on whatever new policies that were coming out. We had direct links to CDC and HUD that were relevant to our members. So we just we kept, and we just, again, like I said, we had this sort of like ongoing monitoring of like up to the minute of like what is a need. And as soon as we heard from somebody, we're putting together FAQ sheets. We're calling someone at HUD to say, hey, our member here has got this thing, what do they do? And so it became this very dynamic conversation, two-way conversation that we were really facilitating, and people were looking to us. I mean, we were the source for the most trusted and the most up-to-date information that people needed to be able to, again, lives were at stake. And I mean, I don't want to overstate or understate that, but it was a very difficult time. We didn't have a crisis communication plan for a pandemic.
Right.
But we knew, like, I guess you know enough that like you need to, in a crisis, you need to make sure that you're staying out in front of the issue, that you are communicating clearly, that you are, you know, that you're, you're being honest about it. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
if you say, if you put out something that's not correct, um, you quickly get out there and say, okay, this is not, I mean, we didn't really have those kind of problems, but we had like when we started going back to in-person meetings, and we were, people had to mask and keep social distance. When we found out that an attendee had COVID following a meeting, we had to send out a message immediately, and we had thought about that ahead of time. Like, okay, if someone gets sick, like, are we going to we have an obligation to contact the attendees, but how are we going to do that in a way? And so we had this all planned out. But that's, I think, the really important thing is that you can't anticipate the actual what the crisis is, but you can make sure you have a policy in place or some plans in place of how do you make sure that when that happens, that your credibility is not at risk, and that you can stay out in front so that your members rely on you, because that's why they're members. They're relying on us to help them navigate this really complex world that we all work in and we all live in.
Absolutely. And I wonder, at some point you must have run into an issue where I know you don't work necessarily directly with landlords, but the idea of the people in charge of the housing, that they were somehow villainized. I just remember this from reading so many posts online or in articles, sort of to a certain extent villainized. Like, how could you charge rent from people who aren't working through no fault of their own? And anyway, I that's probably a whole separate podcast episode. But I imagine when you say getting out ahead of things, that seems to be like that just one that maybe minor, maybe major example of what you're talking about. But
well, yeah, sure. I mean, there were, when there were rent moratoriums, I mean, there were funding. How do you make sure that residents get resources that they need? And that's, that was the role of housing authorities, to make sure that their residents, are safe, and that they, that they're not going to suddenly be, in a situation, and that, that other residents are safe. If someone gets sick with COVID before there were, vaccines or something like that, what do you do in a development? How do you keep that from spreading?
right.
So there's just, a host of different things that they had to do on the ground level, and then also keep their staff safe. So it was,
So many levels.
yeah, I mean, there's just so many different things. Once you start getting, it's like peeling back the onion. And as you just get further and further down, you realize like, oh yeah, this is going to affect that. And so that it really is, you just have to think through and again, try and get as much information out there as you can, as quickly as you can. And again, by creating this resource page, like at least like people knew, like that's where you go. That's where you're going to get the latest information. And as it's updated, we're updating it. We'll send out emails letting people know if something really important is happening. And otherwise, just, you send us an email, we're going to respond. And that's how we got through it.
That's that. Yeah. And sometimes it's good to keep it simple. I don't think you were alone in not having a crisis communications plan for a pandemic. I think most people didn't, but now we're living in a world where probably a lot of people do. So that's that. Thank you for telling that story. Well, before we finish, Blake, I was wondering if you could share maybe you've given us a lot of tips today, actually, but is there one communications tip that maybe not everyone might know about, but has been very important in to your success as a communications director?
I mean, I guess just on a on a sort of macro level, just stay curious, never stop learning, never think you know it all. We have expertise, but not necessarily experts. I think that's an important thing. Just always be open to new ideas, be broad. Get inspiration from things way outside of your area that you're focused on, and that's it. And talk to people.
Yeah,
it's hard. We're so virtual. We're so like I joke when we have started going back to in-person meetings that like I can finally put like it's not a face to a name anymore. It's like, what do you call it now? We put like, a physical body to a screen. I don't know, but
Right. Yeah.
yeah,
No, you have to like update our lexicon there.
yeah, exactly. So,
Well, that's a great place to leave it, Blake.
yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all your really valuable insights today. And I'm wondering if anyone wants to continue this important conversation, can they get in touch with you anywhere online?
Sure. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. I guess it's just Blake Stenning at LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Or feel free to email me at PHADA as well. Just bstenning at PHADA, PHADA.org. I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Blake. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. This was a lot of fun, and I hope that there was something of interest to your listeners.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Okay.